Don't sign that contract. The girl's voice cut through the polished silence like a crack of thunder, sharp and impossible to ignore, and for a split second, every movement in the glass-walled conference room froze as if time itself had hesitated. William Carter's pen hovered just above the final line, the ink trembling at its tip, his signature only a heartbeat away from sealing a deal worth over $200 million, while across the long oak table, executives in tailored suits exchanged startled glances, unsure whether to laugh or call security. The girl stood near the doorway, small, no taller than the edge of the conference table, her dark braids slightly undone, her worn sneakers leaving faint marks on the spotless marble floor, and yet there was nothing uncertain about her eyes as they locked onto the document in William's hand. "I said don't sign it," she repeated, breath catching but voice steady, and this time the room didn't just pause, it listened. A faint chuckle slipped from Victoria Langford, seated at William's right, her posture elegant, her smile practiced and calm as she leaned back in her chair. "Mr. Carter," she said smoothly, folding her hands as if this interruption were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "I believe someone's child wandered into the wrong room." A few people laughed under their breath, the tension trying to dissolve into something manageable, something safe, but William didn't laugh. His gaze had shifted, not to Victoria, but back to the girl, to the way her small fingers were clenched at her sides, to the way she hadn't looked at anyone else, only at the contract. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice lower now, quieter, but carrying across the room with a weight that silenced the last echoes of amusement. The girl swallowed, stepping forward despite the eyes on her. "Zoe," she said. "Zoe Harris." The name lingered in the air for a moment, fragile but firm, and William noticed something then, something he couldn't quite explain, the way she glanced at the page again, not with fear, but with certainty. "Zoe," he repeated, slowly setting the pen down, though his hand remained close to it, as if part of him still wanted to finish what he had started. "Why shouldn't I sign this?" Victoria's smile tightened just enough to be noticed if someone was looking for it, and she leaned forward slightly. "With all due respect," she interjected, her tone still controlled, "this is highly inappropriate. We're in the middle of a legal proceeding." But William didn't take his eyes off Zoe. The room seemed to shrink, the distant hum of the city outside fading behind the thick glass windows, the ticking of a clock suddenly louder than before. Zoe took another step closer to the table, her gaze unwavering now. "Because that's not your signature," she said. The words landed softly, almost too soft for their weight, and yet they rippled through the room like a stone dropped into still water. A lawyer near the end of the table frowned, leaning forward instinctively, while another adjusted his glasses, eyes flicking between the contract and William's face. Victoria let out a short, dismissive laugh, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's absurd," she said lightly. "Mr. Carter has reviewed this document personally." Zoe shook her head, just once small but certain. "I saw the real one," she said. And in that moment, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for William to feel it in the way his chest tightened, in the way his instincts, sharpened by years of building empires and surviving boardroom battles, whispered that something was off. He reached for the contract again, but this time not to sign it, instead lifting it slightly, angling it toward the light streaming in from the floor-to-ceiling windows, the ink catching a faint reflection. The room held its breath, and for the first time since the meeting began, William Carter wasn't thinking about profit or strategy or power. He was thinking about a single question, echoing louder than anything else in the room. What if she's right? The silence did not break all at once. It stretched, thin and fragile, as if one wrong word could snap it in half. And William Carter kept the contract lifted toward the light, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the signature he had seen a dozen times before, yet now it felt unfamiliar, almost distant, like a reflection that did not quite match the face in the mirror. "That is my signature," Victoria said, her tone still smooth but firmer now, leaning forward with controlled confidence, her fingers resting lightly on the table as if anchoring the room back to order. "We finalized this version together last night. A few heads nodded, eager to return to certainty, to structure, to the world where everything made sense, but William did not lower the page. Did we? He said quietly, not accusing, not yet, but enough to shift the air again. Zoe stood still, her small frame almost swallowed by the vastness of the room. Yet her presence refused to shrink, her eyes fixed on the ink like she could see something no one else could. Look at the last letter, she said softly. The room hesitated again. One of the senior attorneys, a man with silver hair and a reputation built over 30 years, leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as he followed her gaze. The R, Zoe added, her voice steadier now, as if each word found more ground to stand on. It curves the wrong way. Victoria exhaled a short laugh, this time sharper, less patient. This is ridiculous, she said, glancing around as if appealing to reason itself. We are taking advice on handwriting from child. A few uncomfortable smiles flickered, but they faded quickly when William slowly placed the contract flat on the table instead of signing it. He turned it toward the attorney. Check it, he said. The command was simple, but it landed with weight. The attorney hesitated only a moment before sliding the document closer, his trained eyes scanning the signature, then pausing, just briefly, on the final letter. His brow tightened. Across the table, Victoria's fingers curled ever so slightly, a detail so small it could have been missed, but Zoe saw it. William saw it too. It could be a variation, Victoria said quickly, her voice regaining composure as she straightened her chair. People do not sign exactly the same way every time. That is true, the attorney replied carefully, but high-value contracts usually follow consistent patterns. The room shifted again, not dramatically, but enough for doubt to slip in like a draft under a closed door. William leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving from the paper to Zoe. You said you saw the real one, he said. Zoe nodded. It was in a blue folder, she said. In the office with the glass wall. You were not there. She was. The word hung in the air, and for the first time, Victoria did not immediately respond. Instead, she smiled, but the smile felt thinner now, stretched. Over something less certain. Mr. Carter, she said, her voice softening, almost persuasive, this is becoming a distraction. We have investors waiting, timelines to meet. We cannot let this turn into a spectacle. William did not answer right away. He looked at the contract again, then at the pen resting beside it, then back at Zoe, who had not moved, who had not looked away, who stood there with nothing to gain and everything to risk by speaking. The ticking clock grew louder. The city outside seemed farther away, and in that quiet, William made a decision that no one in the room had expected just minutes earlier. He slid the pen away from the contract. We are pausing this signing, he said. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but undeniable. Victoria's composure held, but only just. William, she said, dropping the formal tone, there is no reason to delay. He met her eyes now, steady, unreadable. There is every reason, he replied. Then he turned back to Zoe, his voice lowering, the rest of the room fading into the background. Come with me, he said. And just like that, the deal that was seconds from being finalized became something else entirely. A question waiting to be answered, a truth waiting to be uncovered, and at the center of it all stood a little girl who refused to be ignored. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder, quieter, as if the noise and pressure of the deal had been sealed behind the glass doors, and William Carter walked several steps ahead before stopping near a wide window that overlooked the city, the skyline stretching in clean lines of steel and light, while Zoe lingered just behind him, her small shoes barely making a sound against the polished floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. William kept the contract in his hand, the paper now creased slightly where his fingers had tightened without him noticing. And when he finally turned, his expression had changed, less certain, more searching. Start from the beginning, he said, his voice low but steady. Zoe nodded, taking a small breath, as if organizing thoughts that had been racing ahead of her. I was in the office this morning, she said. The one with the glass wall and the big desk. The blue folder was open. William's eyes narrowed slightly. That is my private office, he said, not accusing, but careful. Zoe looked down for a brief second, then back up. I was waiting for my aunt, she explained. She cleans on the 23rd floor. She told me to stay in the hallway, but the door was open, and I saw the folder. William did not interrupt. He only listened. The contract inside looked the same, Zoe continued, but the signature was different. The last letter, it did not curl back. It went straight down. She lifted her finger in the air, tracing the shape slowly, carefully, as if drawing it again in front of him. Like this. William's gaze dropped to the paper in his hand, his mind replaying the motion, comparing it to the ink on the page. A faint tension settled across his shoulders. And you're sure it was the same contract, he asked. Zoe nodded without hesitation. Same numbers. Same name. Same lines. I remember because the numbers were really big. There was no exaggeration in her voice, only observation, simple and direct. William exhaled slowly, his eyes shifting toward the far end of the hallway where his office stood behind another set of glass doors. The reflection of the city flickered across those doors, turning them into a mirror for a brief moment. Did you see anyone else in there? He asked. Zoe hesitated this time, just long enough to matter. Yes, she said. She was holding the paper. William did not need to ask who. The answer settled into the space between them without being spoken. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization, in the quiet recognition that something had moved beyond coincidence. He turned back to Zoe. Why did you come all the way down to that room? He asked. There are 3 floors between here and there. Zoe shifted her weight, her hands clasping together in front of her. Because you were about to sign it, she said simply. And it was not right. The words were small, but they landed with a clarity that echoed louder than anything in the boardroom had. William looked at her for a long moment, really looked this time, not just at a child who had interrupted a meeting, but at someone who had noticed what others had not, who had acted when others would have stayed silent. The hum of the building's ventilation system filled. The quiet. Somewhere in the distance, an elevator chimed. And then, from behind the glass doors at the end of the hall, a figure appeared. Victoria Langford stepped out of the conference room, her posture composed, her expression calm, but her eyes sharp as they found William and Zoe standing together. She did not rush. She walked with measured steps, each one controlled, deliberate, as if nothing had changed, as if everything were still under her direction. William watched her approach, the contract still in his hand, the ink still drying, and for the first time since Zoe had spoken, he felt something shift fully into place. This was no longer a delay. This was the beginning of an answer. Victoria stopped a few feet away from them, close enough for the reflection of the city to blur behind her, but far enough to keep a careful distance, her heels making a soft, measured rhythm against the marble floor before the sound faded into silence. William, she said, her voice calm, composed, almost reassuring, as if nothing unusual had happened at all, as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief inconvenience. The investors are waiting. We should finish what we started. William did not respond immediately. He studied her, not the polished version she presented in meetings, but the subtle details beneath it, the slight pause before her words, the tension in her fingers as they rested at her side, the way her eyes flickered once toward the contract still in his hand. We will finish, he said slowly, but not before we understand something. Victoria tilted her head, just slightly, a gesture that might have passed for curiosity to anyone else. Understand what? She asked. William lifted the contract just enough for her to see it clearly. This, he said, Zoe believes the signature is not mine. The name hung between them, and for the first time, Victoria's gaze shifted directly to the girl. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but there was a sharpness in it now, something colder than before. That is a serious claim, she replied, her tone softening into something almost sympathetic, and a very imaginative one. Zoe did not step back. She met Victoria's gaze, her small shoulders squared, her voice quiet but unwavering. It is not imagination, she said. The real one looks different. Victoria let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it did not quite carry the warmth of one. "You saw a document in an office you were not supposed to be in," she said gently. "And now you are confusing what you think you remember with what is actually in front of us." William's eyes did not leave her. "Were you in my office this morning?" he asked. The question landed cleanly, without emotion, but it carried weight. Victoria did not hesitate. "Of course," she said. "We both were. We reviewed the contract together." William's expression did not change. "After I left," he clarified. There was a fraction of a pause. So small it could have been dismissed. But it was there. "I returned briefly to confirm a clause," she said. "Standard procedure." Zoe shook her head once, the movement small but certain. "You changed it," she said. The hallway seemed to tighten around the words. Victoria's gaze sharpened again, this time not hiding it as carefully. "That is enough," she said, her tone still controlled but firmer now. "William, this has gone far beyond appropriate. We cannot let a misunderstanding derail a deal of this scale." William stepped slightly closer, not aggressively, but with intention, closing the space just enough to make the moment unavoidable. "Then let us make it clear," he said. "If nothing has been changed, verifying it should be simple." Victoria held his gaze, her composure steady, but something beneath it had shifted, something calculating, measuring. "And how would you propose we do that?" she asked. William glanced briefly toward his office down the hall, then back to her. "We compare it to the original," he said. Zoe's breath caught softly, not in fear, but in recognition, as if the path forward had finally aligned with what she had seen from the beginning. Victoria's lips pressed together for the briefest moment before easing back into a controlled smile. "If that is what you need," she said, "then let us not waste any more time." But as she turned slightly toward the office, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the contract, Zoe noticed it again, the smallest tremor, the faintest hesitation, and in that tiny detail, the certainty inside her only grew stronger. Something was wrong, and now everyone was about to see it. The walk to William's office felt longer than it should have, each step echoing softly. Through the hallway as if the building itself were listening, and Zoe stayed close to his side, her small pace steady, her eyes occasionally flicking toward the glass doors ahead where her memory had begun. Victoria moved just slightly ahead of them, her posture unchanged, her stride measured and precise, as if she were leading a routine transition between meetings rather than walking into a moment that could unravel everything. When they reached the office, William paused for a fraction of a second before pushing the door open, the quiet click of the handle sounding louder than expected in the stillness. Inside, the room was exactly as he had left it, immaculate, controlled, the large desk positioned perfectly beneath the wall of windows, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond it, and for a moment, nothing seemed out of place. "The blue folder," Zoe said softly, stepping just inside, her voice guiding the space more than any authority could. William's gaze moved immediately to the desk, and there it was, resting neatly at the corner as if it had never been disturbed. Victoria walked in behind them, her expression calm, almost patient now, as if waiting for this to resolve itself. "You see," she said lightly, "everything is exactly where it should be." William did not answer. He crossed the room, each step deliberate, his attention fixed on the folder as he reached for it, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface before lifting it slowly. The weight felt normal, the appearance unchanged. But something in the air had shifted too far for him to trust appearances alone. He opened it. The sound of paper sliding against paper filled the silence as he flipped through the pages, scanning quickly at first, then more carefully, his eyes narrowing as he reached the signature page. He placed it flat on the desk, smoothing it with one hand, comparing it to the contract he still held from the conference room. The two documents lay side by side now, identical at a glance, the same structure, the same clauses, the same numbers stretching across the page in precise legal language. "This is the one," Zoe said quietly, stepping closer, her gaze fixed on the page in the folder. "Look at the last letter." William leaned in slightly, his focus tightening as he studied the signature in the folder, then shifted his eyes to the one on The contract from the meeting. The difference was small. So small it could have been dismissed by anyone not looking for it. But now that he saw it, he could not unsee it. The final letter curved back in one and dropped straight in the other. A detail that should not exist. A difference that should not be there. The room grew still again, but this time the silence carried something heavier. "It is a variation," Victoria said from behind him, her voice steady, composed, almost reassuring, as if offering the explanation before the doubt could grow roots. "Handwritten signatures are never identical." William did not look up. "No," he said quietly, "but they follow patterns." He straightened slowly, turning just enough to face her, the two documents still visible between them like evidence waiting to be acknowledged. "And this does not." Victoria held his gaze, her composure intact, but there was a new calculation behind her eyes now, something sharper, more deliberate. "You are letting a coincidence become suspicion," she replied. Zoe shook her head again, her voice barely above a whisper, but clear enough to cut through everything else. "It is not a coincidence." William's hand rested lightly on the desk beside the papers, his fingers no longer tense, but steady now, as if the uncertainty had begun to settle into something else entirely. "Who else had access to this office today?" he asked, his voice calm but direct. Victoria's expression did not falter. "Anyone with clearance," she said. "This is a corporate environment, not a locked vault." William's eyes moved briefly to Zoe, then back to the documents, then finally to Victoria again, and in that quiet exchange the balance had shifted. Not completely, not yet, but enough. Enough for doubt to become a question. Enough for a question to demand an answer. And as the light from the windows fell across the two signatures on the desk, the difference between them no longer looked small at all. The light from the floor to ceiling windows shifted slightly as a cloud passed overhead, casting a softer glow across the desk. And for a brief moment, the two signatures seemed to blur together before the difference sharpened again, unmistakable, undeniable once seen. William Carter did not move right away. His eyes remained fixed on the documents, his mind recalibrating, reorganizing, pulling years of instinct and experience into a single, quiet conclusion that settled deeper with each passing second. "This was replaced," he said finally, his voice low, not loud enough to echo, but strong enough to carry certainty. The words did not sound like an accusation. They sounded like a realization. Zoe stood beside the desk, her small hands resting at her sides, her shoulders no longer tense, because for the first time, she was not the only one who could see it. Victoria remained where she was, a few steps behind, her posture still composed, her expression controlled, but the stillness around her felt different now, tighter, as if every movement had become deliberate. "That is a serious claim," she said, her tone measured, careful, each word placed with precision, "and one that requires proof, not speculation." William reached for the phone on his desk, pressing a single button without taking his eyes off the papers. "Bring Mr. Daniels to my office," he said. "Now." He ended the call before a response came, setting the receiver back into place with quiet finality. Zoe glanced up at him, her voice softer now, almost cautious. "Who is that?" she asked. "Head of Compliance," William replied. "He verifies what others assume." The seconds stretched again, but this time the silence was filled with something active, something moving forward instead of holding still. Victoria took a slow step closer, her heels barely making a sound, her presence returning to the center of the room, as if reclaiming ground she had never intended to give up. "William," she said, her voice gentler now, almost concerned, "you are allowing a misunderstanding to escalate into something unnecessary. We have deadlines. We have obligations." William finally looked up at her, and there was no hesitation in his gaze now. "We have a responsibility to know what we are signing," he said. The words landed with quiet force, leaving no space for dismissal. A knock sounded at the door, sharp and precise, and before anyone could respond, it opened. A man in his early 60s stepped in, his suit conservative, his expression neutral but alert, the kind of presence that did not demand attention but commanded respect once noticed. You called, he said. William gestured to the desk. I need you to review these, he said. Mr. Daniels moved forward without question, placing a leather folder on the desk before leaning in, his eyes scanning the two documents with practiced focus. The room seemed to narrow around him as he adjusted his glasses, his fingers lightly touching the edges of the pages, not moving them, just feeling their placement, their alignment. Two versions, he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Identical structure. He paused at the signature lines, his brow tightening slightly as he leaned closer. Zoe watched him carefully, her breath held without realizing it, while Victoria stood perfectly still, her expression unchanged, though her eyes followed every movement. Mr. Daniels straightened slowly, removing his glasses for a moment before placing them back on, as if confirming what he had just seen. These were not signed the same way, he said. The statement was calm, factual, without drama, but it landed heavier than any raised voice could have. William's hand rested flat against the desk now, steady, grounded. Which one is original? He asked. Mr. Daniels looked between the two, then pointed to the document from the blue folder. This one follows a consistent pattern, he said. The other shows deviation that does not align with previous records. The air in the room shifted again, but this time it did not return to neutrality. It moved forward, deeper, towards something that could not be undone. William turned his gaze slowly to Victoria, the silence between them no longer uncertain, but defined. And in that silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. The contract he was about to sign had not been the one he approved. The words did not echo, but they settled into the room with a weight that made everything else feel distant. And for a moment, no one spoke. Not even the city beyond the glass seemed to move, as if the world itself had paused to let the truth land where it needed to. William Carter remained still, his gaze fixed on Victoria, no longer searching, no longer uncertain, but steady in a way that left no room for interpretation. Explain it, he said. His voice was calm, but it carried something deeper now, something final. Victoria did not react immediately. She did not raise her voice or step back. Instead, she let out a slow breath, her composure returning to its polished form, as if she had rehearsed this moment in a different version of events. There is nothing to explain, she said, her tone measured, controlled, each word chosen carefully. A variation in signature does not mean forgery. It means inconsistency, which is common. Mr. Daniels did not move from his position at the desk. This is not inconsistency, he said quietly. This is structural deviation. Zoe watched the exchange, her eyes moving between them, her small frame still but alert, as if she understood that this moment was no longer about whether she was believed, but about what would happen now that she was. William stepped closer to the desk, placing both hands on its surface, grounding himself in the reality of what lay before him. You were in this office, he said, not as a question, but as a fact. You had access to the original document. Victoria's gaze held his, unflinching. Yes, she said, as did others. But you were the one holding it, Zoe added softly. The words were not loud, but they cut through the space with quiet precision. Victoria's eyes flickered toward her again, and this time the patience was gone, replaced by something sharper, something less forgiving. You should not be involved in matters you do not understand, she said, her voice still even, but colder now. Zoe did not respond. She did not need to. William straightened slowly, his posture shifting from observation to decision, from uncertainty to control. Mr. Daniels, he said, without looking away from Victoria, initiate a full audit of all document revisions related to this contract. Mr. Daniels nodded once. Immediately, he replied. The words settled like a line drawn across the moment. Victoria's expression tightened just slightly, a change so subtle it might have gone unnoticed in any other room. But here, now, it stood out. William, she said, her voice lowering, almost warning. You're escalating this unnecessarily. This will create complications you do not need. William's eyes did not soften. If there is nothing wrong, he said, then there is nothing to worry about. The logic was simple. The impact was not. A silence followed, but it was no longer fragile. It was defined, structured, shaped by what had already been revealed. Zoe shifted her gaze to the documents again, then back to William, her voice barely above a whisper. "There is more," she said. William glanced down at her, his expression changing just slightly, not questioning, but attentive. "What do you mean?" he asked. Zoe hesitated for a brief moment, then pointed to the contract he had nearly signed. "The ink," she said. "It looks darker, but only in some places." Mr. Daniels leaned in again immediately, his trained eyes scanning the page, his fingers hovering just above the paper as if tracing the pattern without touching it. "Different pressure," he murmured. "Possibly different pen." William's gaze sharpened further, the final pieces beginning to align into something undeniable. He looked back at Victoria, and this time there was no space left between what was seen and what was understood. "This was not an accident," he said quietly. And in that moment, the room shifted completely, from doubt to clarity, from suspicion to truth, and from control to exposure, while the one person who had tried to keep everything perfectly balanced now stood at the center of a reality she could no longer adjust. The air in the office no longer felt neutral. It carried a quiet pressure, the kind that builds before something breaks, and William Carter remained still for a moment longer, letting the weight of everything settle into place before he moved. Then, without raising his voice, he reached for his desk monitor and tapped the screen, bringing it to life with a soft glow that cut through the tension. "Access logs," he said. Mr. Daniels stepped closer immediately, understanding without needing further instruction, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision as the system responded, layers of security unfolding one after another until a timeline appeared on the screen. Names, times, entries, exits. The quiet hum of the system filled the room as data replaced assumption. Zoe stood slightly behind William now, her eyes drawn to the screen, even though she could not fully understand the details. But she could feel the shift, the movement towards something concrete, something undeniable. Victoria remained where she was, her posture still composed, but her attention sharpened, her gaze flicking briefly toward the monitor before returning to William. "This is unnecessary," she said, her tone controlled, but no longer soft. "We are turning a minor inconsistency into a full investigation." William did not look at her. "If it is minor," he replied, "it will remain so." Mr. Daniels leaned in slightly, his eyes scanning the timeline, his finger tracing down the entries until he paused. "There," he said quietly. William stepped closer. "What is it?" he asked. Mr. Daniels pointed to a line on the screen. "Your office was accessed at 9:42 this morning," he said. "After your departure." William's gaze did not move from the screen. "By whom?" he asked. Mr. Daniels tapped once, expanding the entry, and the name appeared. The room seemed to tighten around it. Victoria Langforth. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was complete. Zoe's breath caught softly, her small hand tightening at her side, not in fear, but in recognition of something she had already known. William slowly turned his head, his eyes finding Victoria again, and this time there was no question left in them. "You said standard procedure," he said. Victoria held his gaze, her composure still intact, but something had shifted beneath it, something no longer hidden as easily. "It is," she replied. "I had clearance. I reviewed the document." Mr. Daniels continued scanning the log, his voice cutting gently through the moment. "There is another entry," he said. 9:58. Document modification timestamp. William's eyes flicked back to the screen. "Show me," he said. The system expanded again, revealing a digital record, a file update, a version change, precise down to the second. "That corresponds to the contract file," Mr. Daniels explained. "The version prepared for the meeting." Zoe looked up at William, her voice quiet but certain. "That is when it changed," she said. William did not respond right away. He did not need to. The timeline spoke for itself. The pattern was no longer a possibility. It was a sequence. Entry. Access, modification, presentation. Victoria stepped forward slightly now, closing the distance, her voice steady, but carrying a sharper edge. You are drawing conclusions from incomplete information, she said. Files are updated all the time. That does not prove intent. William finally turned fully toward her, the light from the monitor reflecting faintly in his eyes. Then help me complete the information, he said. The words were calm, but they carried something unyielding beneath them. A challenge, a line that could not be stepped around. For a brief moment, Victoria said nothing. The silence stretched, thin but tense, as if waiting for something to give. And then, for the first time since this began, her gaze shifted, not to William, not to the screen, but to Zoe. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. Because in that single glance, something unspoken surfaced, something that no data log could record, but that everyone in the room could feel. The balance had broken, and there was no way to put it back. The silence did not linger this time. It shifted, sharpened, turned into something that demanded resolution. And William Carter stepped away from the monitor slowly, his mind no longer searching for possibilities, but aligning facts into a single, undeniable direction. Open the document history, he said. Mr. Daniels nodded at once, his fingers moving again across the keyboard, pulling up a deeper layer of records, one that traced not just access, but every revision, every saved version, every hidden change that lived beneath the surface of a finalized file. Lines of data filled the screen, timestamps stacked one after another like footprints that could no longer be erased. Zoe watched quietly, her eyes following the movement of the cursor, not understanding the system, but understanding the tension, the way every second felt heavier than the last. Victoria remained still, her posture controlled, but her gaze no longer lingered casually. It tracked each motion, each reveal, each step closer to something she could not redirect. Here, Mr. Daniels said softly, highlighting a section. Version 12. William stepped closer. What about it? He asked. Mr. Daniels expanded the file history, revealing a comparison overlay, lines of text marked with subtle changes, additions, removals, adjustments that were invisible in the final document but unmistakable in the system. Clause revision, he said, and ownership distribution. The words settled slowly, but their meaning did not. William's eyes narrowed, his focus locking onto the highlighted section as he read. Then read again, the numbers aligning into something that shifted the entire structure of the deal. That is not what I approved, he said quietly. Zoe looked up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. What does it say? She asked. William did not answer immediately. His gaze remained on the screen, his jaw tightening slightly as the realization settled fully into place. It transfers controlling interest, he said at last. The room seemed to still completely. Mr. Daniels nodded once, confirming what the data already showed. Majority control shifts upon execution, he added. Zoe's small hand tightened at her side again, not out of fear, but out of understanding, simple and direct. That means, you lose your company, she said. William did not correct her. He only stood there, the weight of it pressing quietly into the space around him. Victoria stepped forward then, her heels finally breaking the stillness with a soft, deliberate sound. That is a strategic adjustment, she said, her voice steady, controlled, but no longer soft. One that was discussed in principle. William turned his head slowly, his gaze meeting hers, and this time there was no space left for interpretation. Not like this, he said. Mr. Daniels continued scrolling, his finger pausing again. There is more, he said. William looked back to the screen. What now? He asked. Mr. Daniels highlighted another entry. Authorization field, he said. This version was marked as final using your credentials. The words landed with a different kind of weight, one that extended beyond the document itself. William's expression did not change, but something deeper shifted, something that connected the action to intent. But I did not authorize this version, he said. Mr. Daniels nodded slightly. Then someone used your access. Zoe looked between them, her voice quiet but clear. She was holding it, she said again. Victoria's composure tightened, not breaking, but narrowing, her control becoming more precise, more deliberate. You're building a story from fragments, she said. This proves nothing without context. William stepped forward, closing the distance between them just enough to make the moment unavoidable. Then give me the context, he said. The room held its breath again, but this time it was not waiting for doubt to resolve. It was waiting for truth to surface. And in the glow of the screen, where every change had been recorded, every second preserved, the story was no longer fragmented. It was complete. The only thing left was whether it would be denied or finally spoken aloud. The room did not move, but something inside it had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and William Carter stood there with the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. The truth no longer hidden in shadows or assumptions, but laid out in precise timestamps and deliberate changes. You used my credentials, he said, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that left no space for interpretation. Victoria did not answer immediately. She held his gaze, her expression composed, but the silence stretched longer than before, no longer controlled, no longer strategic, but measured against something she could not easily redirect. Your system allows authorized access, she said finally, her voice even, careful, but missing the softness it once carried. That is not the same as misuse. Mr. Daniels glanced briefly between them, then back to the screen, his voice steady as he added, the authorization was entered manually, not through automatic session continuity. William's jaw tightened slightly. Meaning, he said, meaning the credentials were actively used, Mr. Daniels replied. Zoe looked up at William, her eyes searching his face, not for answers, but for confirmation of what she already understood in her own way. She changed it, she said quietly. Victoria turned toward her again, and this time there was no patience left in her expression, only a controlled sharpness that no longer bothered to hide itself. You are repeating something you do not fully understand, she said. Zoe did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She simply said, I saw it before it was changed. The words settled into the space with a kind of finality that even the system logs could not replicate. William took a slow breath, then reached forward and tapped the screen once more. Pull up security footage from this office between 9:30 and 10:15, he said. Mr. Daniels did not hesitate. Yes, sir. The system shifted again, the data dissolving into a video interface. And after a brief moment, the footage appeared, slightly muted in color, the angle fixed from a corner of the room that captured the desk, the chair, and the blue folder resting exactly where it had been found. The timestamp blinked at the bottom. 9:42. The door opened. Victoria stepped into the frame, her posture the same, composed, deliberate, her movements smooth as she approached the desk. No hesitation, no uncertainty. She reached for the blue folder, opened it, and began to review the pages. Zoe's breath caught softly, her small hand lifting slightly as if pointing to the screen without touching it. That is what I saw, she whispered. William did not speak. He watched. The footage continued. 9:58. Victoria paused, then reached into her bag, pulling out a pen. Not the one on the desk. A different one. She adjusted the paper slightly, her hand steady, her movement precise, and then, with a motion that lasted only a second, she wrote. The room seemed to hold its breath again, even though the action had already happened, even though it could not be undone. Mr. Daniels leaned slightly closer to the screen, his voice quiet but clear. That corresponds exactly to the modification timestamp, he said. William's eyes did not leave the footage. The moment repeated in his mind, not as a question anymore, but as confirmation. When the video ended, the screen faded back to stillness, but the image remained, fixed in the air between them, impossible to ignore. William turned slowly, his gaze settling on Victoria. No anger, no raised voice, just a calm that felt heavier than anything else in the room. You alter the contract, he said. It was not a question. It was the truth, spoken without force, without hesitation. And in that moment, the last piece of doubt disappeared completely, leaving only what had been there all along, waiting to be seen. The words settled into the room with a quiet finality, and for a moment, no one moved. Not even the faint hum of the building seemed to reach them, as if everything had narrowed down to a single point where truth could no longer be reshaped. Victoria Langford stood still, her gaze fixed on William Carter, and for the first time since this began, the control in her expression did not disappear, but it changed, becoming sharper, more deliberate, no longer focused on concealment, but on calculation. You are interpreting a single moment without understanding the larger structure, she said, her voice steady, measured, but no longer soft. William did not respond right away. He simply looked at her, the evidence already behind him, the footage still lingering in the air like a memory that refused to fade. Then explain the structure, he said. There was no pressure in his tone, no urgency, only expectation. Victoria took a slow breath, her posture straightening slightly, as if resetting herself within a different version of control. The adjustment was necessary, she said. The deal as originally written was unstable. The investors would not have committed under those terms. I made a correction to secure the outcome. Zoe's eyes widened slightly, her voice quiet but clear. You changed it without telling him, she said. Victoria's gaze flicked toward her, but this time she did not dismiss her. I made a decision, she replied, one that benefits the company in the long term. William's expression did not shift. At the cost of control, he said. Victoria did not deny it. She held his gaze, and for a brief moment, the silence between them felt different, not uncertain, not tense, but exposed. Control is not always the priority, she said. Stability is. Mr. Daniels remained near the desk, his presence steady, his voice calm as he spoke again. Unapproved modification of executive contracts violates internal governance policy, he said, regardless of outcome. The words landed with a different kind of authority, one rooted in structure rather than emotion. William nodded once, not to Daniels, but to the reality of what had been said. Then he stepped away from the desk, closing the distance between himself and Victoria just enough to make the moment impossible to ignore. You did not secure the company, he said quietly. You tried to take it. The words were not raised. They did not need to be. Victoria's expression held for a second longer. Then something shifted. Not a break, not a collapse, but a subtle release, as if the effort of maintaining a different narrative had finally reached its limit. I positioned it, she said, for someone who understands how to protect it. Zoe looked up at William, her voice soft, but filled with something steady. He already does, she said. William glanced down at her for a brief moment, and in that look, something grounded returned, something clear and undeniable. He turned back to Victoria, his voice calm, final. You are suspended, effective immediately, he said. All access revoked. The words settled without resistance. Victoria did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply stood there for a moment longer, her gaze moving briefly to the screen, then to the documents, and finally to Zoe. It was not anger. It was something quieter, something that recognized the moment for what it was. Then she turned, her steps measured as always, and walked toward the door without another word. The soft click of it closing echoed faintly in the room, and with it, the last trace of uncertainty disappeared. William stood still for a moment, then exhaled slowly, the weight of what had nearly happened settling into something real. Zoe shifted slightly beside him, her voice gentle. You did not sign it, she said. William looked at the documents on the desk, then back at her, and for the first time since this began, there was something different in his expression, something quieter, something human. No, he said. I did not. The room felt different after the door closed, not lighter, but clearer, as if something that had been quietly distorting the air was finally gone. And for the first time since the moment Zoe's voice had cut through the boardroom, the silence no longer carried tension, it carried resolution. William Carter remained standing beside the desk, his eyes resting on the two contracts still laid out under the soft glow of the overhead lights. The difference between them no longer subtle, no longer hidden, but obvious in a way that felt almost unsettling. He reached out slowly, gathering both documents into his hands, aligning them carefully as if acknowledging the exact point where everything had nearly gone wrong. "Archive these," he said quietly, handing them to Mr. Daniels. "Both versions. Full record." Mr. Daniels nodded once. "Yes, sir," he replied, taking the papers with deliberate care, already turning toward the system to secure them properly, his movements precise, controlled, as if preserving evidence that would speak long after the moment had passed. Zoe stood near the edge of the desk, her gaze shifting between the empty doorway and William, her small shoulders relaxing just slightly now that the tension had begun to settle, but her eyes still carried the weight of everything she had witnessed. "Is it over?" she asked softly. William looked at her, really looked at her again, and this time there was no distance in his expression, no barrier of position or authority, only a quiet acknowledgement of what she had done. "The contract is," he said, "but what comes next, we decide carefully." Zoe nodded, not fully understanding the business behind his words, but understanding the meaning behind them, the idea that something important had been protected, something that could not be easily replaced. William moved around the desk then, stepping closer to her, lowering himself slightly so that he was no longer looking down at her from across a distance, but meeting her at a level that felt human, present. "You saw something no one else did," he said. Zoe shrugged lightly, her voice simple, honest. "It looked wrong," she said, "and you were about to sign it." William let out a quiet breath, almost a faint laugh, but not from humor, from realization. "Most people in that room have years of experience," he said, "and they did not see it." Zoe tilted her head slightly. "Maybe they were not looking," she said. The answer was simple, but it settled deeply. William glanced briefly toward the window, the city stretching out in clean lines of glass and steel, then back to her. "Maybe," he said. Mr. Daniels finished securing the files, then stepped back slightly. "The audit process will begin immediately," he said. "All related access points will be reviewed." William nodded once. "Good," he replied. Then his attention returned fully to Zoe, and the room seemed to quiet again around that single focus. "You said your aunt works here," he said. Zoe nodded. "She cleans the offices," she said. "She told me not to go inside, but the door was open." There was no guilt in her voice, only honesty. William considered that for a moment, then nodded slightly, as if acknowledging not just what she had done, but why. "You did the right thing," he said. Zoe looked down briefly, then back up. "I did not want you to lose everything," she said. The words were simple, but they carried something larger than their size, something that reached beyond contracts and companies into something more human, more real. William felt that weight, not as pressure, but as clarity. "I did not," he said, "because you spoke up." The room held that moment quietly, without urgency, without tension, just a stillness that felt earned. Outside, the city continued as it always had, unaware of how close something had come to changing inside this one office. And in that quiet space between what had almost happened and what had been prevented, something else settled into place, something not written in any contract, not recorded in any system, but understood clearly by both of them. Sometimes the smallest voice is the one that changes everything. The office did not rush back to normal. It settled slowly, like a surface of water after a stone has sunk beneath it, and William Carter remained where he was for a moment longer, looking not at the skyline, not at the desk, but at the quiet space where everything had shifted. Then, with a measured breath, he straightened and reached for his phone again. "Have the board notified," he said calmly. "Emergency review. Full transparency." Mr. Daniels nodded from across the room, already moving. To carry out the instruction, his presence steady as the system began to hum quietly again, recording, documenting, restoring order in the only way it knew how. Zoe stood near the edge of the desk, her fingers lightly brushing against the smooth wood as if grounding herself in the reality of what had just happened, her eyes moving once more toward the window where the city stretched endlessly beyond, unchanged and unaware. "Do things like this happen a lot?" she asked softly. William glanced at her, then followed her gaze out toward the skyline. The sunlight catching on glass towers that reflected back a world of certainty that did not always exist inside. Not like this, he said. Not when people are paying attention. Zoe nodded slowly, absorbing the words in her own way, then looked back at him. Then you should keep paying attention, she said. The simplicity of it settled deeper than any formal advice ever could. William allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to touch his expression, not one of relief, but of recognition. I intend to, he said. A quiet knock came at the door, softer this time, and when it opened, a woman stepped in hesitantly, her uniform neat but worn at the edges, her eyes immediately searching the room until they found Zoe. There you are, she said, her voice a mix of concern and relief. I've been looking everywhere for you. Zoe's face brightened slightly. Aunt May, she said, stepping toward her. The woman glanced between Zoe and William, her posture tightening slightly as she realized where she was. I'm so sorry, sir, she said quickly. She's not supposed to be in here. I told her to wait. William shook his head gently. It is all right, he said. She was exactly where she needed to be. Aunt May looked confused for a moment, then back at Zoe, then at William again, unsure how to respond. Zoe simply reached for her hand, her small fingers wrapping around it with quiet certainty. William stepped closer, his tone calm, sincere. Your niece prevented a serious mistake today, he said. One that could have cost more than just money. Aunt May's eyes widened slightly, her gaze dropping to Zoe with a new understanding, a new weight. She did, she asked softly. William nodded once. She did, he confirmed. Zoe looked down for a brief moment, then back up, her voice gentle. I just said what I saw, she said. William considered that, then reached into his jacket, pulling out a simple business card, but instead of handing it to Aunt May, he handed it directly to Zoe. If you ever see something that does not feel right again, he said, you tell someone who will listen. Zoe took the card carefully, as if it carried more than just a name, her eyes meeting his with quiet understanding. Okay, she said. The moment lingered, not dramatic, not loud, but steady, grounded in something real. Outside, the city moved forward as it always did, unaware of the contract that was never signed, the decision that was never sealed, and the quiet voice that had changed everything before it was too late. And as Zoe turned to leave with her aunt, her small hand still holding the card, William remained by the window for a moment longer, not looking at the empire he had built, but at the truth that had just saved it, simple, clear, and impossible to ignore.